Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you everybody for joining. My name is Paula Murphy and I'm our Chief Client Officer here at Halloran Consulting Group. And welcome to our Halloran Town Hall, the last Halloran Town Hall of 2021. I can't believe it. But today's topic is a real important one, and you can sort of see by the folks, the number of attendees we have on this town hall here in terms of just, right before sort of the mad rush that's coming up. We still have some great attendance. So thank you everybody for joining. Today's topic is on achieving better clinical trial outcomes by strategically targeting underserved patient populations. So I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves in a minute, so we'll go through, but certainly we welcome the partnership with Science 37 and many of our folks here today. So just so you're aware too, these town halls, were founded a few years ago, really to kind of share experiences together as a life sciences community. We have just such great access to each other and to some amazing science and development that's going on. So we want to find more opportunities here, and the town hall is just one of these forums for us to be able to share insights, learn from each other. Please, we do encourage this to be an interactive session in the sense that as you have questions, please ask, don't hesitate to ask. There's never a dumb question here. If you have also some case studies or some lessons learned that you want to share as well, I'm sure the panelists and Rashida will be happy and welcome to hear from you on that. Now, we will have you guys on mute just to allow sort of some Q&A with the panelists and the moderators today. But if, as we get going, please include your questions in the chat box. We will make time for the Q&A as well. And you can also unmute yourselves. If you're on the phone, you can press, I think, *6 to get unmuted as well. Okay, but next slide. So I'm going to introduce our moderator, and then Rashida, I'll have you turn it over and have the panelists sort of, I think, introduce themselves as well. But Rashida Challenger is a senior consultant here at Halloran Consulting Group with more than 15 years of experience in clinical operations, really with an emphasis in oncology and rare disease. But I know Rashida's been really, really active in leading the charge and pushing innovative operational solutions forward with a special focus on improving clinical outcomes through patient centricity and patient diversity in clinical trials. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Rashida, and please introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you all for joining us for our town hall. Our topic today, as Paula stated, is achieving better clinical trial outcomes by strategically targeting underserved patient populations. And I'm thrilled to be joined by our esteemed panelists. This is a topic we're all very passionate about, so I'm looking forward to a lively discussion with you all. So before we start, I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Jocelyn Ashford.
Hello, I am so excited to be here. My name is Jocelyn Ashford, and I lead patient advocacy, global patient advocacy at BridgeBio Pharma's cardiorenal businesses. So I've been in industry almost 20 years now, and I've worked on rare and not so rare conditions. And I've worked across, you name function that probably sits in commercial. I've probably had that job at some point in industry. I started my career in patient advocacy, quite a few years ago now. But that's me. I'm super excited for the conversation.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Thanks for joining us. And then we'll go to Michelle Rhee.
Thanks, Rashida. Very excited to be here as well. My name is Michelle Rhee. I'm the VP of Patient Affairs and Advocacy at X4 Pharmaceuticals. My history, I started out as a cancer patient and as a rare disease patient. I have an ultra rare disease. There are about 700 people diagnosed with it. And that's what led me into patient advocacy. I've worked on the nonprofit and the for-profit side, and I've worked in gene therapy, enzyme replacement therapy, small molecule, sort of a variety of modalities, and at startup from 5 people to thousands of people at Big Pharma. And I'm really excited about this topic.
Great, thank you so much, Michelle. And Ryan Pack.
Hi, Rashida. Hi, Halloran team. And thank you for pulling together such a wonderful discussion today. And a bit of my background. So I actually had family members participate in a pivotal clinical trial, and it helped change the game for me to understand that people of color do participate in clinical trials. And when we do, we can add a meaningful difference. And their data led to a program and a project being approved and help to eradicate a condition. So it's personal for me in that respect. I've been working on diversity initiatives for over 15 years, starting in academia, trying to find more men for a school of nursing, to trying to find more diversity for all the various schools of neuroscience, public health, and so on and so forth. Fast forward, I've been in the clinical research space for about 12 years now, and I worked in operations to strategic commercial roles, and I'm so thrilled to be at Science 37, where I head up our innovative foundation, which is focused on improving diversity in clinical research, and also our business unit that has representation from every functional area within our organization. And so it's really exciting to be a part of a innovative space and an innovative organization. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ryan. And now over to our attendees. We're so happy to have you here with us today. If at any time during the discussion you have a question, as Paula said, feel free to put the question in the chat feature below, and we'll be sure to leave time at the end to have open discussion with you to ask your questions. We'll be recapping the discussion today with notes and takeaways, and we'll be sure to share them with you early next week. So before we kick off our discussion, we thought it'd be fun to ask a poll to our audience to see where you are with your DE&I initiatives with your respective companies. So I think Maria is going to enter this poll. If you take the time to just answer a couple of questions for us, just to kind of give us an idea of where you all stand. All right. How are we looking on poll?
We're still getting answers, Rashida, so we'll just give it maybe just 30 more seconds.
Okay.
43 participation so far, 43%.
Nice.
We're still getting answers. This is great.
That is awesome.
All right, I think I'll end in 10 seconds.
Okay.
And then I will share the results. I don't think you'll be surprised by these answers. So
I don't think so.
Here
I
we
think
go.
this is the meat of what we're saying, right? So how often do DI efforts come up in your trial planning? So it looks like sometimes, but look at where always is 18%. I mean, I think this is why we're having this conversation today, right? And then, are you experiencing barriers? I think that's really the meat of this discussion. Are you experiencing barriers to implementing your clinical trial design? And the answer is yes. So that kind of leads us into my first question. You know, for the past year and a half, we've all been talking about DE&I efforts in clinical trials and within the industry. But how do we get past the talk, right? How do we start actually moving towards the implementation of the plans that we've been talking about for the last year and a half? So, and then let's also talk about what are the barriers. So maybe Michelle, what are your thoughts?
I would say that absolutely. It's sort of a simple thing if you're working on, like, I've worked on a trial for people with sickle cell disease, and then people are very gung-ho about recruitment for minority populations. But when you're looking at sort of a more broad clinical trial population, the commitment has to be shown in the decisions and actions, not just this general conversation. And I think one of the things we talked about is that, like, good intentions don't really matter, and it doesn't really work unless there's actually a mindset shift, and there has to be actual a deeper decision across the board to change across the company. It can't just be one person who's saying that they want to do it. There has to be a team effort, like a company-wide cultural shift to make
Yeah.
that happen.
Michelle, I concur with you there. From my experience as far as being able to move the needle in a meaningful way for diversity, it starts, I'd say, at the most senior levels of the organization, both with the executive leadership team, along with the board. And, making sure that that commitment is tied to meaningful corporate objectives, right?
Right.
That
I'm
really.
so sorry to
Sorry,
interrupt.
yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
Amy, I believe you're screen sharing by accident, and for some reason, I can't stop it on my end here. There we go.
Okay,
Sorry,
great.
everybody. Sorry, Ryan.
Sorry,
Please-
Ryan.
No worries, no worries. That's important. We don't want to see what we're not supposed to see.
Right.
And that's another interesting piece too, right? It's having transparency and visibility, right, to those goals and those actions, because otherwise it makes it really difficult for the organization to know whether progress is being made. So I'd say, 3 key steps. It starts with the board and the executive leadership, making sure it's a concerted effort, carving out more than just a work stream and a task force. While those things are a good start, from my experience, the organizations that have been most successful with really moving the needle, they make it a very serious imperative, and then tying it to meaningful metrics and goals. And again, that depends on every organization. It depends on where you are in your journey, right? And so you can always adjust the goals as time goes on, but making sure that they're measurable, actionable, where you can track and trend to see what's working, what's not. And then having that open, transparent communication and feedback loop to have the dialogue and reporting out on the outcomes across all the various business units and functions. And it really helps, from my experience, as well as having champions in every division. So that way diversity doesn't fall by the wayside, but everyone understands how they're function, whether it's the data management team, to the operations team, to clinical, to executive leadership, to finance. Like, everyone has to have some skin in the game to really move the needle. So I'd say those are the 3 key things to really take action on today to make a difference.
Those are some great initiatives. Thanks. There's some recent guidances and proposed legislation that focus on DE&I efforts. Ryan, do you want to touch on high level what some of those are?
Absolutely. Rashida, as we saw the FDA guidance that came out in November of 2020, right? It was a great step to really give some clear elucidation as far as what organizations could do to move the needle. And I think what we're seeing is that diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials is not a nice to have anymore, right? It's here to stay. So we're seeing such things, right? Like the HR, the House of Representatives Acts, the Cures 2.0 Act, there's a DEPICT Act, right, that's being proposed. There's the HR.831 Health Statistics Act. There's a Senate bill that's a Diverse Trials Act, and a couple more that are in the docket. So I think all that to be said, one of these is going to pass, and they are starting to require organizations to take a concerted look at having diversity measures as part of their clinical development plans, and really mapping out what actions they took, especially for various disease states, how that's being measured in the data, the demographics, both from provider standpoint and patient standpoint. There's some really interesting pieces there. So, not sharing any of this to scare sponsor organizations, but just to get ahead of it, right? To understand that it's not lip service, it's not like a nice to have anymore, but it's truly an imperative. And I think with things like legislation coming down the pipeline, coupled with guidances, it's really helping support all key stakeholders and actually taking meaningful action and having a reason to do so. And diversity truly is a gift, if used appropriately. Right. So absolutely. I welcome, the panel's feedback and your thoughts there.
Yeah, Michelle or Jocelyn, any thoughts?
I love when there are guidances and legislation that you can use internally if there is any resistance, or if there are people who are unsure, or because people love to be able to go by regulations and guidance. And so having that there as a basis ammunition, however you want to frame it, is fantastic. So if like that that's like that's what I look for. I'm always looking for something that I can utilize to help my internal stakeholders understand, and to give them a reason to say yes.
Yeah, because I mean, at the end of the day, it's what will push the needle, like you said. Like I can't just, it's just not a nice to have. I have to do this if this is mandated in some way. Jocelyn, any thoughts? I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I think, so you asked, what is this solving for? And I think it solves for our inertia as an industry. And we talk about diversity a lot. And as you know, we talked about in the last question, we weren't getting to action. And some of that doesn't come down to intentions. I think the intent has always been, well, for the most part, has been positive. But we often get caught up in, but what are we allowed to do? How do we make sure that we're still accomplishing what we're here to do, which is actually get treatments to people that need them? And this, honestly, I think is solving for our own inertia, our own inability to jumpstart ourselves. And it's in its response to questions of how do we do this in a way that's not going to come back to bite us later. And so this gives us an anchor. It's really a baseline. This isn't, to me, none of this legislation is meant to solve all of the problems, but it's to help us feel a little bit more comfortable around where are the boundaries, where do you start, what could this look like, so that ultimately we're not just creating medicines for a small group of people, but we're creating medicines that will actually treat what our population here in the US looks like. And I think that ultimately is the bottom line on what does this legislation solve for?
And
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
No, Michelle.
We all want to add to this. And I think, because I think one of the things Jocelyn said there was also important, it's the how to do it, because biopharma is very risk averse. If something worked in the past, people just want to keep doing that because they're like, oh, that worked, we're going to keep doing it. That's what we need to do in order to succeed again. And there's a lot of fear in making a change because then that might be the reason that it fails in the future. And so if there is something laid out, guidances, legislation, something that allows the opportunity or the space to make a change, to be innovative. We saw that with COVID-19, with the guidances that came out from the FDA, that suddenly companies were willing to be more innovative, to stretch a little bit. Thank you, Jocelyn, for the heart. Then, I think it's similar here, where we're giving people space to be innovative, to make change, and to feel safe doing it.
Michelle, I love what you said there too. Both you and Jocelyn, so it's the inertia to make a difference and also the capacity to be innovative. And what some of the legislation points to as well is embracing new ways of doing things, right? And allowing precedent to be set where digital endpoints, for example, can be acceptable, right? And looking at new modalities of reaching investigators or reaching patients to where things really are patient-centric, and allowing new techniques to be deployed. So that way, patients who need it most are getting access to care. We can see, how things are working, and hopefully we can find safer, more effective ways. And then more importantly, it's really looking at how can we overcome, I think, the DE&I fatigue, right? So by not having this legislation in place, by not having true guidance in place, by not having mandates, it loses some of the steam. Whereas by having this in place, it helps us overcome the fatigue and actually get to meaningful action with support to move the needle, right? So it really helps foster way more innovation and sustainability for organizations moving forward.
Totally agree. So what are some of the real risks and concerns of our industry not following these guidances?
I mean,
I'll open it up to all of them.
I think the most obvious risk is that we have medicines that don't work, or in some cases are harmful to the people that are supposed to be using these treatments. And I think in the other case is they may not actually get the opportunity to even try some of these treatments because, they aren't represented in the population that's been studied. So just from my perspective, it's probably pretty simple. It's those three things. They don't get to try, they don't work, or they could be harmful.
Great. Anyone else? All right. So we talked about, the guidances, but what are some actionable steps companies can take to bring more initiatives into their clinical development planning and clinical trial design process?
This is one where I think the inclusion exclusion criteria is a sort of simple basic one that you can start with in terms of just across the board. If you're trying to really understand how a therapy is working and how it's going to work, then you want to be more thoughtful and not as risk averse as always, but be thoughtful about how you are framing and how you are designing that inclusion exclusion criteria, because sometimes it can be by, it's not intentional, but there is bias sometimes baked into those, and being cognizant of that and being thoughtful about how you're doing that. When you're thinking about that trial design, that by in itself also speaks to the fact that you want to have diverse people working at the company, because that also then impacts how they're looking at the trial design, how they're looking at that inclusion and exclusion criteria.
That's a great point. Jocelyn?
I think, I sit in patient advocacy. And so for me, I am going to advocate for engaging the community, engaging advocates, both disease specific, and there are other, advocates out there. I think one of the problems that I personally have observed in my work on the clinical trial side is that because we've done things the same way for so long, and it's worked. It's been very successful in achieving the goal of getting drugs through the clinical trial process and getting drugs approved. I think that we are hesitant to bring in any other perspectives that are going to, from our perspective, slow things down. But sometimes you have to think differently in order to speed things up. And I think that bringing in advocacy organizations, having them be a part of the process, because guess who knows the community better than we know the community, or better know this disease from a practical standpoint better than we know this disease? It's the advocacy organizations, hands down, in many cases. Not all, but in many cases. And they really need to be partners when it comes to figuring out what that clinical trial is going to look like and how you might consider bringing in some of those diverse perspectives. And like I said, not just disease specific, but outside. Who else in parallel worlds has experience? If you look at the representative population of whoever has the conditions that you're looking to design a clinical trial around, who else has experience from an organization standpoint in engaging with these individuals? And those might be people you might want to consult as you think about designing a clinical trial and recruiting for a clinical trial for these diverse populations.
Great. Ryan, any thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, I think sitting in the agile clinical trial model, it's a bridge between all these different worlds, right? To bring the patient into the study and providing them that access that they've been lacking. I, think to a couple of different cases, and I think of some asthma medicines, for example, that were largely ineffective in African-American populations. And there was a limited participation in the studies. And so things are being prescribed blanketly in the real world and aren't really treating people in the way they need to be treated. And so part of that is how can we reimagine things to reach into community, right? So when we're talking about diversity in clinical trials and practical tools and tips, when we think about the fact that for a lot of patients, there are access challenges, there are work challenges often that we see where it takes people, a lot of time, take time off work to meet the study needs and design, along with the inherent lack of trust for so many different reasons, which is very pervasive in countries and regions where colonialization has been pervasive. Then you look at it from the sponsor perspective, the incentive at times has been low because things have been working in the traditional way. And then there are also the barriers to reaching these populations, right? And then a reticence to want to work with research naive sites or bring people along the journey. Because again, getting to what Michelle was saying, that risk averseness, and then looking at it from a provider standpoint, those that want to put their hands up and say, hey, we're here. we've got these patients. I want to make sure that whatever I'm prescribing them for their asthma or whatever condition is really going to work and keep them out of the ER because they're experiencing some AEs that I wasn't aware of and I was just doing the best I could, or I don't have the research infrastructure to participate. So then, you look at an organization, for example, like Science 37, for example, that does agile models where we can kind of bridge that gap and bring people along and reach into community, but also go direct to patient where we can bring things to them directly. So, one of the things I would say I would challenge organizations to think of is, reimagine your protocols when possible, kind of like what Michelle was saying. Really look at that inclusion exclusion criteria, really assess your schedule of assessments and events. I'm a scientist by training as well. Believe me, I geek out on data, as much data as possible. I want to know. But sometimes when you blend it from the patient perspective, as Jocelyn was saying, and the practicality, do all those PK analysis make sense? Do we need to have all those blood draws? Do I need to keep you in this office for 10 hours? I don't know if it makes sense. So how can we blend the book learning with the common sense, the real world, and come up with new ways of reaching folks and reimagining so that way we can reach across the aisle to build trust with these communities so we can really drive transformation? And also, how can we leverage technology in new ways to drive innovation and hopefully, in some instances, accelerate the timelines and enrollment and really help us achieve those endpoints faster, sooner, better with really good, robust data? So a lot of interesting pieces here. Rashida, obviously, I'm extremely passionate about this.
I know.
So I will pause there and hand it back over to you.
Okay. So I kind of want to pivot to the topic of partnering. What are your thoughts on how sponsors can partner to reach DE&I goals? What does that look like? We talked a little bit about it, but if we can get a little bit more in detail. Ryan, I'll go to you first.
Okay, and actually I'm seeing some really neat things in the chat line too that kind of talk about the partnering and some of those bits. So someone I want to say raised a question regarding some examples of the unconscious biases that exist in the inclusion exclusion criteria. So I can give a concrete example where a sponsor was very keen on leveraging technology, new modalities to reach diverse populations. We have the capacity to partner with community hospital institutions, providers, folks that are Medicaid and all these other pieces, or research quote unquote naive. However, in reviewing the criteria, they shared they really want to reach the Hispanic Latinx community. Yet one of the primary criteria for inclusion was must be fluent in English. I'll just let that sit there for a second. So, we really have to be mindful about what our priorities are and reimagine ways of creating more inclusivity whenever possible when designing our studies, to take a closer look, and also thinking more broadly, not so myopically, but thinking globally and acting locally. And even within communities, there are tons of communities. So even with like the Black community, for example, there are people that speak French or Spanish or English and everything in between. So making sure our materials can speak to that. So as far as partnering technology, I would say, if an organization is limited in certain areas or maybe is a little risk averse, look to partners and community agencies or other technology providers that can help you shore up some of those areas. So if your organization, for example, is a bit reticent to work with research naive institutions, looking at partnering with folks who have seasoned board certified primary investigators with broad licensure, for example, that can bring those research naive sites along as sub-investigators and train them up. And they are the primary investigators on the 1572. So, they hold the responsibility with their broad licensure and their understanding and strong skills without alienating communities, right? And they can actually help you reach communities in new ways. And so thinking in creative ways of, just because you can't directly do something, looking to partners that might have that expertise and leveraging them to help you augment and reach the end goals is a really great way.
Great. Michelle, any thoughts?
I was actually thinking about that specifically around translation topic, because you can't just do it like a straight language translation sometimes. That doesn't work. There has to be some thought put into it. There's sometimes just like a cultural translation that needs to happen. And an example that I'll give that was really rough for me was I was working with a patient population that was primarily Southeast Asian, and I was looking in the UK. And the majority of the patient population was an immigrant population. And so I was talking with the patient community, with the patient advocacy groups, as Jocelyn was saying, like they're a wealth of information and so helpful. And they were saying that, oh yeah, most of them don't speak or read English. And I said, okay, great. What languages do they speak and read? And they said, well, they speak their native language. They do not read it though. And so when we were thinking about how we educate and how we engage, we had to work with the patient advocacy groups to understand how do they get information, how do they absorb it, what are the ways that we can actually engage with them. And when I think about that, and when I think about the entire conversation we're having, my experience has primarily been in ultra rare and rare disease patient communities, and the approaches that we use in terms of like finding patients, going where the patients are. Like we will literally, the majority of my studies have been, even if they're confirmatory, like phase 3 studies are double-digit trials. So these are like tiny, tiny trials. And so we literally will find a patient and then open a site where that patient is. And and so to Ryan's point, doesn't matter if that PI is research naive. We don't care because that's where the patient is. And similarly here, if you know where your patient population is, that diverse population, you go where they are, you open the site there. You go, and like this population in the UK, we tried to figure out like, how do they communicate? How do we communicate with them? And same thing here, you can apply the same idea, the same learnings about like, this is a unique population that we're underserving. So how do we serve them? How do we communicate and how do we serve them?
So it's just applying a skill set that many of us already have, just into a different focus. So I think that's an awesome thought. Jocelyn, any thoughts here?
Yeah, I think we've brought forward a few examples. I think another one that's really, to me, low-hanging fruit is how do you partner with the sites that are already in your investigator site network, the sites that you're already working with. And I have learned that many of these sites actually have the capabilities to enroll diverse populations, and they may actually within that institution be applying those skills somewhere else, just not to your trial. And so to me, one piece that is really important and valuable is partnering with your actual sites to make sure they understand what your expectations are, and helping them, highlighting that this is important, that if you're an institution that says diversity is important to you and you're one of the top in the country when it comes to that, how does that reflect, whether that's in your feasibility, your deep feasibility, your site visits, really holding them accountable, and setting expectations around how you're going to work together to make sure that you are engaging these diverse populations that maybe you have concerns may not be balanced in your clinical trial, because there's a lot of knowledge there. And we often don't tap into it because we say the sites know what they're doing. We'll just train them on the actual protocol and let them go. And that it doesn't work.
Right. We don't tap into the resources that they do have and make sure that it's applied. I agree. So you've talked about there are some other successful patient engagement examples that you've seen or directly experienced that sponsors can glean? Michelle, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think actually one thing I wanted to add on to what Jocelyn said before we go on to the other one, before I forget, is that it is also, even talking with the sites who maybe don't have experience, and also talking with them about looking at how to recruit diverse patient populations, because again, some of the more old school thinking about recruitment in terms of like trying to find that patient who you know will be compliant, the patient who you have experience with, the patient, like that kind of thinking is one that sort of they like a PI might just by virtue of the way they've always worked have their own personal inclusion exclusion criteria that they haven't told you about, but that they use when they're thinking about who they want to include in a study. And so talking with the PI about that and the study coordinator, because the study coordinator is the one that's actually helping to find the patient.
Doing the work.
And talking with them about that as well can be really, really helpful. I started out my career out of college as a study coordinator. And so, you have your own personal inclusion exclusion criteria. You have a lot going on. But if the sponsor has that conversation and says that we really value this, then that makes a difference. That impacts what's going on. But to your point, to the other question, sorry, I forget what the other question was you first asked.
I was asking about some specific patient engagement examples you've seen.
Yes. So for specific patient engagement examples, I think there's a nice actually connection that I've seen with specific communities and ethnicities with those doctor or medical organizations. So so for example, for me growing up, there was the Korean American Medical Association, because my parents would only take me to Korean doctors and Korean speaking doctors. And then they got to talk about, because my Korean was terrible, so they got to talk about me behind my back in front of me with the doctors. And as I was saying, we'd been recruiting specifically people of Southeast Asian descent, but I've been working in, certain other disease areas with specific minority populations, and working with those medical associations as well can be really helpful sometimes.
Great. Michelle, any thoughts? I'm sorry, Ryan, I apologize. Ryan, any thoughts?
On some practical tips, and I've been reviewing some of the thoughts here too, right? And some of the practical pieces, folks are expressing, right, that sponsors may not want to pay more for some of these extra efforts and different pieces. Yeah. But in some circumstances, right, with the upcoming legislation, and also what we've seen from agencies who have been rejecting trial data and asking people to augment the data or rerun the study to make a more robust trial, can sponsors afford to do that by not doing it from the beginning? It's really looking at what matters most sometimes. And I think I'd like to also help dispel the myth that by including more diverse, focused pieces into a trial design, that it automatically is 10 times more expensive. Sometimes it's really better understanding behavioral insights. So by working with trusted sources, by reaching into community, by leveraging media buying partners or digital strategists, and really looking at the behavior science as far as why people participate, where they participate, where they're fishing, where they're going for information, and making sure that you optimize your outreach efforts to meet those pieces. It can actually help you be more efficient and effective in the spend, to where maybe not everything is far more expensive. So some tangible, practical bits that people can use and leverage are, taking the time when possible to listen. Two, taking a disease-informed approach when it comes to stratifying your protocols and looking at things, because as we're looking at diversity, it's more than just the US, right? So if you can actually leverage those epi insights to better understand where the populations actually are, and then trying to build studies where the patients are, you might be more effective in meeting enrollment goals than just doing the same old, same old. So I think those are some practical bits where we can leverage data to help us optimize some of our study design and our outreach efforts, and also really collaborating with community to understand those behavioral nuances. Like Michelle was saying, the folks might be speaking in their native language, but they may not be reading it. So collaborating with those community health workers are really reaching folks where they are, and getting creative, right? And reaching folks, whether it be rural or urban areas, near or far, really understanding where people are.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think
Michelle?
if you can look at it like collectively, so if you're able to combine like the changing the inclusion exclusion criteria to make it broader and to say like you'll be able to recruit faster if you're excluding this people, like this many people, and then maybe you'll be like, maybe if you do slow it down a little bit because you're doing something else here, you're able to show sort of like if you're doing this overall with the trial, you're making these overall changes instead of looking at each individual piece of it, because there might be some pieces that are going to take more time or more money. But also what Brian mentioned in the beginning, which is like, if there's a guidance that you can point to and say like, it's the guidance. We just have to do it because of the guidance. That's like my favorite thing to point to. And there are more and more companies that are doing this work and that are publishing on it because they like to show how wonderful they are. Don't mean to be mean about that, but like they like to publish the work that they're doing. And so being able to benchmark against other companies and to be able to bring that in and to say, oh, like this is now becoming the industry standard. This is what all companies are doing. Anything external that you can bring in can also help with that.
And Michelle, if I can add one more thing to that. I want us to kind of, it seems really daunting and scary, like we haven't been doing this, but the industry has been doing this for years. When we look at the requirements set forth by PMDA in Japan, people have had to run studies for Japanese populations, and there have not been qualms. While it can be challenging, we get them done, and we've been doing them for decades upon decades. So if we can apply some of the similar learnings in a broader way, I think it might make it a little easier to overcome some of the inherent barriers that exist in changing the mindset that's required to successfully execute on such studies.
Yeah, but that kind of falls into having to do it. And, like, nice to have, but not necessary, right? I want to touch on, just in the interest of time, I want to touch on some of the questions in the chat. So one of the questions was, how does layering technology into trials help or hurt the inclusion of diverse populations? And how do your organizations think about the impact of these novel modalities on inclusion? I'm sorry, Maria, you okay? Oh, all right. So to the panelists, I'll open that up to anyone that wants to tackle that.
I can start here. I think technology, just like anything else, can be really useful or it can actually be harmful. And I think that as long as that technology, there's been some foundational work done to think about who needs to use this technology and how do people interact with the particular technology you're trying to apply, I think it can be really, really valuable. I can give a tangible example in this, and it's not going to sound overly, like you say the word technology, maybe you're thinking, what are all the apps and gadgets that you can offer? I'm going to go super old school and classic, which is during the COVID-19, we talked a lot about taking these making clinical trials more virtual and accessible. Well, you forget that not everyone I'm just going to use the United States as an example because it's even different worldwide, has access to internet. So, what might be a great Zoom call with a doctor or other type of video call might not work. And so therefore you'd be isolating all the people who don't have access. Could be because they're rural and they don't have the fastest internet or satellite service. But thinking about what is the right technology for this case. And in the case of virtual clinical trials, sometimes it's just telemedicine, picking up the phone and just using the plain old telephone, this way or this way, depending on your era, pick up the phone and just have your visit that way. So I think that technology can be useful or harmful when it comes to inclusion. And again, it just comes down to, have you done the work beforehand to recognize that different people interact differently? And does this technology really meet the needs of the community you're looking to serve? Or is it just yet another cool piece of technology to say that you've added on and bolted on to your clinical trial? And I'm not going to stay on this soapbox, but I'm going to make one comment around this idea around people not wanting to spend the money on DE&I efforts. I see a lot of money spent on a lot of tactics when it comes to clinical trials that fall flat, millions and tens of millions of dollars. So if you're willing, to spend money on things that you literally are going to say in a month aren't going to work, and you knew it wasn't going to in the beginning, then I would imagine that you can take a little bit of effort to spend a couple $100,000 or less on some types of DE&I programs as well. So I personally don't think it's fair, and I think if anyone on this call is from BridgeBio and you've been in a meeting with me, I'll hold them accountable to those things as well. So I don't buy the money argument.
And I think also another good example to bring, I think Lori had put it in the chat at the beginning, which was for Moderna with their vaccine trial. They were running at full speed. So in the beginning, they maybe hadn't like baked in diversity recruitment, but as they got closer to the end, their proportions were skewed. And so they had to slow down and sort of stop the recruitment so that they could recruit more diverse populations and minority populations. And if they had done maybe more of that in the beginning, that wouldn't have been as much of an issue. And so providing some of those examples as well, where if you just plan ahead or plan from the beginning, then that won't be a problem.
Absolutely, Michelle. And to that point, I was thinking there's another great example that's currently going on when I think about the All of Us research project that's currently being sponsored by the NIH, right? Where they've got a goal of reaching roughly 1 million people, all different walks of life. And we're talking about diversity on top of diversity, from age to gender to everything in between. And some of the key things that they've deployed, for example, is not just relying on patients to look on clinicaltrials.gov to understand what's going on in this space and how to find a study, but actually getting into community. I think they did like a 37-week listening tour. Now, I know not all of us can afford to do 37 weeks of listening. However, I think there's some tactics as far as working with trusted community advisors, whether it was the Native American and Indigenous people population, and working with the tribal councils directly to really understand why people would participate, what their hopes and dreams were, and what their fears were, what the challenges were, but also getting into community, hosting educational events where people could get more than just trial information, but also collaborating with local partners to provide helpful screenings for people, and speaking to them and reaching with them in ways that were practical and easy. I've got a lot of family members, right, who are in Kentucky and other areas, and we like to go to the buffet. So sometimes you got to break things down in easy, tangible bites. We can't always speak in medical terminology to reach the hearts and minds to help people understand why something matters for them to participate. I think, sometimes it's sharing something as simple as, if you knew that lupus disproportionately impacts people of color by 43%, and I'm going to prescribe you a drug, but I only have data for roughly 10 to 14% of people that look and feel like you, I think that is huge. And people understand, oh my goodness, you want me to take something that hasn't been tested in me, and I'm supposed to make sure it's safe. So making sure that when we're communicating to the patients that we serve in ways that they can understand and readily pick up, that's a great way to build trust. And then also going through trusted sources is crucial and key. So because technology, to Jocelyn's point, it can be a very powerful enabler, but you got to be mindful. And I was working on a rural maternal health program, right? So looking at how can we work with doulas or community health workers or people in community to reach the folks that maybe are suffering from lack of broadband, and can we go old school a bit and do some home visits, right? Leveraging technology and specialized networks like home health nursing in combination with the telemedicine to make people feel comfortable and going to them to overcome those barriers. So there is a way, there's a will, we can get it done.
We can, absolutely. In the interest of time, we're joined today by Claire Monnier, who's the COO of Digital Medicine Society. And I wanted her to take some time to speak to the group. Claire, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Really great to be a part of this conversation. So I was the one who asked the question about integrating technology into clinical trials and the impact it has on our DE&I strategies, partially because I'm genuinely interested, but also because there's some work going on at the Digital Medicine Society. It's actually just forming now, focused on driving inclusion in digitized clinical trials. And just to introduce you to Dime's work. We convene pre-competitive collaborations from groups across the ecosystem to come together and work on some of our biggest challenges. And integrating technology into clinical trials, I think, is one that everybody is really excited about. I appreciated Jocelyn's comment, like not just to do it because it's sexy, but because there's deep meaning for the trial results that we can garner from it. And I think particularly as we see more wearables and smartphones being integrated into trials, we risk further alienating the populations that we're all working so hard to do more around including. And so my goal here, oops, are you guys still with me? Okay, so our goal in this project is to really come up with the best practices for the field and come up with frameworks for engaging folks at various moments in the trial development process, and to put that out. So we'll make it publicly available, and maybe we can even partner with Halloran to share the resources once they're out there. But for groups that have experience in this area and who are thinking about it actively, we'd love to have you guys join us for the project. And I just dropped a link to a forum where you can just give me your contact information for anyone who's interested. But we'd certainly welcome folks on the call to the table if they want to dive into this further.
Thank you so much, Claire. That is great. We have about 7 minutes, so I want to open it up. Maria, is that okay?
Yes, absolutely. We can open it up to questions, but I did have an anonymous question in the chat that I just wanted to bring up with the group. And that is, what is some advice for initiating these conversations when you are the only woman and only person of color at the organization? Any advice?
Jocelyn, you look.
First,
Michelle, do you want to tackle that?
I'm sorry. First, and then second, I would actually say to start with HR. So because at least for me with patient advocacy, I've been partnering with HR more broadly around DE&I at the company. And as we've been talking, like just around like hiring, around the culture at the company, around all of that at the company. And so if there's that larger conversation, I think Ryan had mentioned it also when we were just saying like there has to be a cultural mind shift at the company. I think being able to talk with HR first and having that conversation initially can start, and they might have also more insight into something that might be going on at the company. There might be some conversation around DE&I, possibly not based on what you're saying, but also feel free to message me on LinkedIn and connect, and I'm happy to talk with you more one-on-one.
Yeah, and Maria, to that question, I would say often that was me in my career. And so what I would challenge whomever that is to do, is to be great at what you currently do, because nothing earns the ear of others in your organization than when you do great work, when you contribute, when you add value. And if you can come from a space of value, you have no idea how you can rally folks that don't look like you to move the needle. And there have been several individuals who don't look like me, who don't feel like me, who have not come from my walk of life, who've come from all different parts of the world, whether it be from Europe to everything in between, who have rallied to help move the needle. And it takes all of us collectively to do this. It's not just a Black person's responsibility, not just a Latin or Asian, it's all of us together. And so I would say come from a space of value, add a lot of value, and then you can also in small, meaningful ways tackle some side projects, raise an initiative that aligns directly with some major corporate goals and share how that can fold into accelerating and advancing those things. One of the most difficult things to do is if you come at it solely with your agenda, but think of win-win solutions that can actually help advance the whole organization, and it's bigger than just you, and then tie that into things that people do care about. And I think that, that in collaboration with HR or other business functions, but look at the controllables, control what you can control in your department, and then add some value there. And then also look about cross-pollinating across other departments and raising your awareness to what other initiatives are going on. And perhaps is there a way or an opportunity where DE&I can be a hidden gift that can help accelerate some of those other broader initiatives and paint the picture in ways that matters to other people's why. And you can be really, really successful in getting some really cool things done.
That's a great response. Thank you, Ryan and Michelle. I want to open it up to everyone to ask questions. Please, you're free to take your, to come off of mute. Anyone?
Hi, this is Jane Thurston. I'm really glad to be a part of this today, and everything you've said really has a lot of meaning. I have spent a lot of my time really trying to work on the whole issue of diversity. And again, working for a clinical research organization, my job is on the pre-award side. So I get all of these studies that come in, and my job is to develop patient recruitment and retention tactics and strategies. So I already typed something in, but so I'll just reiterate that I struggle, about, right now, a lot of the times, I recommend using clinical enrollment managers to do community outreach, to work with patient advocacy groups, but I keep feeling like there's got to be more. There's got to be, better ways. I believe in what you've said about, mentoring, new investigators, especially new investigators of color, right? And helping and some of these more established sites to really partner with them. But I guess what I'm saying is, I feel like I'm stagnant. Does that make sense? And I just am really grasping for more and better ways. I would like to think that there are.
Jane, I'm going to just tackle this really, I guess I'll be the first to tackle. I think what you've identified is where a lot of us are. And I think that the tactics that you've come up with are incredibly great tactics. They're also tactics, even as you say them out loud, they're tactics that I could easily see someone from an internal standpoint saying, I don't know if we need this.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
So I'm going to just run off a list of a couple of things that I think are going to feel really basic, but are things that CROs can't even ask of during the bid process of sponsors. Things like, have you thought about embedding someone on your clinical trial study team that actually looks like the people, or is the profile of some of the people that you want to recruit? What does your actual study team look like internally? And at this CRO, we can make sure that the people working on this study are also, from an experience or ethnicity or where they live standpoint, also are in the places where the people are that you're looking to recruit. Those are just a couple of really easy ways that don't cost any money for people to be thoughtful about thinking about DE&I efforts, and it's not going out of their way. It's working within the processes that already exist to find new ideas. And then the last is kind of something different, but the same, which is focus groups. Instead of going out and having someone else do the focus group for you and take those insights, how do you gather those insights and make them really accessible and personal to the people that are really building that clinical trial?
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you,
you,
Jane, for the question. We are running out of time. I honestly think we could talk about this for another hour. But just for all those that did provide questions, we will answer those questions post-meeting and provide them to you in the notes and takeaways next week. So I just want to thank Michelle, Ryan, and Jocelyn for joining us today, and for all of the attendees for joining. This has been a great conversation. I'm hoping we can get to do it again. So thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend and a great holiday.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Happy
everyone.
holidays. Thanks, Rashida.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
you.